guys, welcome back. It's your girl Lavonda Handy, LMFT from Truth Center for Health and Healing, and of course I have Nicola Pierre-Smith, LPC from Melanated Women's Health. Nicola, how are you today?
Doing good. Sleep wasn't the best, but hanging in there.
It happens, right? It happens.
Yeah, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well, actually. I got some beautiful, nice warm tea. It says, when the praises go up, the blessings rain down.
That's what I like to hear.
Here's to that.
Yeah. So today, trauma, big topic.
Big topic. I think it actually leads pretty well from last week's, as we talked about the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, and going into a little bit more of a definition of like what trauma is and how that impacts our families and what it looks like for you today. I think it's a fantastic kind of segue from last week. What about you?
I do agree. I think also for our YouTube video, there's no way we can spend like a really long time talking about trauma on YouTube. That could take hours and many different videos doing that. So it may be a great idea to let's start with definition of what trauma is. Mm-hmm. Maybe we could go into racial trauma, because that could be relevant for us, and sharing some personal perspectives on that, and perhaps generational trauma, that could be helpful. And then putting in there a few little techniques for how to cope and deal. What do you think?
I'm totally down for that. Let's go for it. Why don't you start us off with defining what trauma is and letting the people know?
Yeah, so in its simplest terms, trauma, and I'll say this too as a disclaimer, right? Like, people typically look at trauma responses to say that's trauma, but it's not. It's a reaction to trauma. And what trauma actually is, it's an event that causes any kind of psychological or physical or emotional distress that can be life-threatening. So if you think about examples, like for some people, a car accident could be traumatizing. A home invasion could be traumatizing. Neglect and physical abuse could be traumatizing. Sometimes the trauma event ends, and then it's the response to the event that then we call a trauma response. So that could be like flashbacks, and that's really like memories that seem true even though they happened in the past. So flashback to an event. It could also be like nausea, headaches, dizziness, anxiety, and any kind of distress could be responses to that. Sometimes there's this like living or walking on eggshells, or living in survival mode, all responses to trauma. What would you say are other examples or types of trauma events?
So I think about, you refer to like home invasion. I think about like fires, right? Like if your house catches on fire, or as California and kind of some of the West Coast is experiencing are the fires of their like neighborhood, right? Like mass destruction, flooding, natural disasters are all trauma events because you're so displaced. So tornado, flooding, hurricanes, any of that such is a trauma event. I would even go as far to say is this pandemic, right? Essentially, because we are all in this like edge of fear of like
the unknown,
not knowing when is something going to happen. So those are just a few of what could be traumatic events,
Yeah. And then in going further, and as you're talking about the pandemic, so there's also racial trauma, in saying that the psychological distress is based on someone's race. It's based on events that are life-threatening, has a direct connection to bias, to discrimination, to racism, that then has someone fear for their life being in jeopardy, not knowing what certain interactions could lead to, and then having these responses of whether it's a flashback. I think about as we're watching the news and seeing Black lives being lost to police misconduct and brutality, you can see yourself in those images. Like that could be me, that could be my brother, my sister, a loved one, a friend enduring that.
Right. I would even go, just like watching the news and having your own response, like living daily life. Like, how do you feel when you get pulled over by a cop? Like, what
Right.
is that instinct that comes up to you? I know my heart starts to race of like, I don't know what's going to happen. And make sure my hands are on like 10 and 9. And then I'm also telling the police officer exactly what I'm reaching for in my car,
Yeah.
like, because there's so much that fear, that trauma response, because there's so many events prior to that that have showed you that like this could end in a way that was very traumatic. So even as far as that, like my own personal experience and having a trauma response to that traumatic event that I've witnessed on TV or social media for years.
Yeah, and racial trauma and race-based stress are used interchangeably, and that's exactly what you're describing, the stress of that interaction, that your Black female in America having an interaction with the cops. You've had many reminders of what that interaction could look like, with it being a loss of your own life. So that hypervigilance and that cautiousness in the interaction leading to those heart palpitations, or even I know like sweaty palms,
Mm-hmm.
or like this really like people refer to it as a knot in their stomach, but it's really like nausea and our body preparing us
Right.
for a potential situation that could be life threatening.
So that leads me to think about the transgenerational trauma or intergenerational trauma or generational trauma, however you want to use the term. But this is a sense of their passed along generations, in between generations of trauma that is have been unresolved or is still leaving an impact on a groups of people. Like we still reference in slavery and race relations and different things as such. Is like we're
Mhm.
carrying these things
Yeah.
intergenerationally with our families, and so that could be down to not only like response to like racial interactions, but it could be like the way we parent, right? Our emotional response to different things, of a parent-child relationship. If a parent hasn't had a parent of their own that address their emotional needs, that skill can then be passed down to them as they parent their own children,
Mhm.
and they are not available emotionally because one, they haven't been taught that skill, or even how to access different services and how we ask for help. There's this like survival kind of instinct, and you got to be strong. And I'm going to do things on my own. I don't need other people. Also, it can be passed down error responses to like mental health, medical needs. If I'm going to just ignore that, like I'm depressed or I'm anxious or different things, I'm not going to go seek help in those different manners. So that can be passed down generationally.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out too this piece about the like dynamics being passed down through a generation. It's not necessarily starting from a place of them not wanting to seek help.
Right, right.
It's starting from a place of if we're going back like 2 or 3 generations. Like I know for my granddad, he was born in the 1920s. If you think about when his parents were born, right? Like this, there is no one to ask for help with emotional needs. As a matter of fact, those aren't important in the moment because it's based on surviving
Yep,
enslavement,
yep.
right? And like that's not something that's being considered. We're looking at it now that we're just a few, because I'm not going to say we're several generations, we're a few generations
Hmm.
forward in that for us, there's not chattel slavery
Hmm.
happening. So no, or survival mechanisms are just a little less activated where we can even consider caring for mental and emotional needs at this time.
But even think about like, okay, so we're a little like removed. from some of those things, but it's been passed down to even to think about epigenetics, right? And so there's like a whole like science around that I'm not as qualified to give you the definitions around like DNA change, but there are modifications to stress responses, right? And so, you know, there's 3 different types of stress. There's good stress, bearable stress, and then toxic stress. And then when you have these traumatic events, you know, good stress can even lead to that anxiety. Bearable stress becomes unbearable, and you won't even get to the idea of the toxic stress that leads to something like we could be completely shutting down, when that's leading to like depression and needs to self-medicate with different drugs and such. And so our natural responses change even down to our DNA because of these traumatic events that have not been treated before, or, you know, talked about, resolved, anything like that. We're passing it generationally. Our body makeup in response to different things has been passed along to our children.
Yeah, and you said you're not like equipped to talk about epigenetics, but I think you did a great job. Like in its basic form, epigenetics refers to like gene coding or modification that's happening because of this like stressor or like traumatic event that occurred. Like our bodies are designed for that, to keep adapting to changes as a form of our survival, right? So that's occurring like before a child is even born. The parents' genes are adapting, and if those genes are then passed down to you, you've received an adapted gene. And it's like that's in its simplest form. Obviously there's more biology and more technicalities, if you want, in terms of describing, but that's really what it is. Epigenetics, the changing of the genes being passed down, and some of that is impacted by racial trauma.
Yeah, for sure. So what do we do with this information then? Like, we know like this trauma is being passed down to us. We know that it exists generationally. Like, how do we manage, you know, healing, addressing it? Like, what do we do?
Yeah, so one of the first things to consider too, like something that's needed for trauma healing to like truly occur, is safety. And if we're talking about race-based stress and racial trauma, that's something that continues and hasn't necessarily like stopped completely. So I guess a better question is like coping with a racial trauma versus like healing from that right now, because I think we would be like really minimizing what's happening around us. So maybe that's a better conversation to have. And something that I'm always promoting is the very first thing needing to happen is that acknowledging that this is happening, right? This heart palpitation and these different like physiological symptoms, they are occurring. You're not making them up. You're not just paranoid or going crazy. Something's happening. And so first acknowledging that, and then engaging maybe even in like mindful practices. You know, when you talked about that scenario of getting pulled over, like something that should be included in that as well is starting to practice like abdominal deep breathing, where you're getting you're into your nose, out through your mouth, as you're clearing out toxins that are building up as this stressful situation is occurring.
Right. I love that you said that is like the acknowledging that it's happening, right? Having that awareness that your response is a normal response to a traumatic event, right? And not having this innate feeling that like something is wrong with you, but rather like something is happening to you, and that's real. And that awareness allows you to feel some sense of comfort. One, that you're not alone in that distress, right? There are other people that are having that response, and having some of that normalized will help you cope along with the feelings that are coming out for you. And then one, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you make a great point in terms of like connection and community, because you're not experiencing this in isolation. I think sometimes people are experiencing race-based stress in the workplace, you find yourself being anxious about work performance, right? And maybe you're in a situation where you're the only Black or person of color in that situation, and it's like finding community to voice this with and getting feedback and how to navigate these spaces.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And then like lots of education, right? Like, because if we are kept in a dark about certain things, then that leads to more of that feeling of isolation, right? That community, that connection, our awareness, and then education of how we can all cope together. And then also inform others of how to be a support to us. Because I think that lacks in the space of people don't know how to respond when somebody else is having a trauma response, and they end up being dismissive to someone
Right.
else's experience, you know?
Yeah. And something else too, especially given the current climate of 2020, like the news, knowing when to take a break from that, or even social media,
Right.
as viral content is going around. And I saw this label online, trauma porn, and that's exactly
Mm,
like what it is. You're repeatedly seeing this content, and perhaps rather than watching those viral videos, maybe you're reading something about the person's life or the interaction that happened, rather than adding that visual
yeah.
that's really distressing. So knowing when to step back from that, not sharing that kind of content or also consuming it for yourself.
Right. Yeah. It's all about, I love that you called it coping, right? Like, how can you make it through? Because the healing may not come, it may not come today, it may not come tomorrow. There's still like a lot of work to be done. So
Yeah.
how can we cope through? And I love that skill of, decreasing your access to social media, and then maybe more like in-person conversations, connections around the actual feeling or distress, or sometimes we just need a distraction, right? Like, what is going to be some positive light into our spaces while there's so much happening that is bringing distress.
Yeah. Mhm. So I like that.
Me too. Me too. I think there are probably a ton of other things that we could offer people, um, as a way to cope through this. So I would wonder, and I would hope that people would comment below and share with us some of their really amazing ways that they're learning how to cope with racial trauma, trauma in general, and generational trauma, and what they're doing to cope and kind of change some of those patterns that we've seen over the years.
Yeah, so like, comment, and subscribe for more mental health content from myself and Lavonda. You can find us on Instagram at Truth Center HH, or at Melanated Women's Health, and we'll be bringing you more mental health videos.
All right, guys, see you next Monday.